Hey Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes. We probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings series. But before we get to today's topic, I just wanted to mention that New Line Cinema is developing The War of the Rohirrim, an anime film due to be released in theaters. It's going to take place 250 years before the War of the Ring and cover the reign of Helm Hammerhand, for whom Helm's Deep is named. I actually did a Helm Hammerhand video 2 years ago in which I mentioned that his story would make a great movie, so I'm all in. I prefer live action, but I'll take an animated version. I'll put a link to my Helm Hammerhand video in the description in case you're interested. And now, on to today's topic. Part 4, the finale of the Galadriel series. Just to give you a peek behind the curtain, when I prepare for these videos, I assemble the relevant quotes, then I craft the best story from that material. Usually I start with 5 or 6 pages of quotes, cut it down to 3, and go. For Galadriel, just in the Third Age, I started with 22 pages of quotes. So it took a while to pare this down to a manageable size. Okay, when last we left our elven hero, the year was 1981. Dolly Parton's 9 to 5 was topping the Billboard charts. Okay, that's a different 1981. But Amroth, king of Lorien, had just drowned at sea, and Galadriel and Celebrian had assumed leadership of the Golden Wood. Though notably, they did not take on the titles of king and queen, calling themselves guardians of the realm instead. I should also note that this is a fearful time in Lorien because the Balrog had just revealed itself in Moria in the year 1980. Here's a good quote about Galadriel's decision to lead the elves of Lothlorien. It's from Unfinished Tales, the chapter entitled The History of Galadriel and Celebrian. In her wisdom, Galadriel saw that Lorien would be a stronghold and point of power to prevent the shadow from crossing the Anduin in the war that must inevitably come before it was again defeated, if that were possible. But that it needed a rule of greater strength and wisdom than the Sylvan folk possessed. Nevertheless, it was not until the disaster in Moria, the Balrog, when, by means beyond the foresight of Galadriel, Sauron's power actually crossed the Anduin, and Lorien was in great peril, its king lost, its people fleeing and likely to leave it deserted to be occupied by orcs, that Galadriel and Celebrian took up their permanent abode in Lorien and its government. But they took no title of king or queen, and were the guardians that in the event brought it unviolated through the War of the Ring. So we see that Galadriel chooses to defend Lothlorien, at least in part, because of its strategic importance. And she apparently doesn't have faith that the Sylvan elves can do it themselves. Remember, she is not a Sylvan elf. She's a Noldor elf, and arguably the wisest elf in Middle-earth. And one of the ways in which Galadriel defends Lothlorien is with Nenya, the elven ring of adamant. I talked about Nenya in my Part 3 video, but I wanted to add this quote from the Silmarillion that puts the status of the elven rings in perspective. This is from Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. Of the 3 rings that the elves had preserved unsullied, no open word was ever spoken among the wise, and few even of the Eldar knew where they were bestowed. Yet after the fall of Sauron, their power was ever at work, and where they abode, there mirth also dwelt, and all things were unstained by the griefs of time. Therefore, ere the Third Age was ended, the elves perceived that the Ring of Sapphire was with Elrond, in the fair valley of Rivendell, upon whose house the stars of heaven most brightly shone. Whereas the Ring of Adamant was in the land of Lorien, where dwelt the Lady Galadriel. She herself was of the Noldor, and remembered the day before days in Valinor, and she was the mightiest and fairest of all the elves that remained in Middle-earth. But the Red Ring remained hidden until the end, and none save Elrond and Galadriel and Círdan knew to whom it had been committed. Of course, we know that the red ring, Nenya, was secretly given by Círdan to Gandalf. But it is noteworthy that Galadriel was entrusted with this secret. And that's probably due to her involvement with the White Council. I mentioned this briefly in part 3 because there was a Second Age prototype of the White Council that Galadriel attended in Rivendell. But it becomes more of an institution in the Third Age, and Galadriel is the pivotal member. The quote I'm about to read from the Silmarillion references the Watchful Peace. That era comes to an end in 2460. And 2463 is the year of the first White Council meeting. This is also from the chapter of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. Ever most vigilant was Mithrandir, and he it was that most doubted the darkness in Mirkwood. For though many deemed that it was wrought by the ring-wraiths, he feared that it was indeed the first shadow of Sauron returning. And he went to Dol Guldur, and the sorcerer fled from him, and there was a watchful peace for a long while. But at length the shadow returned, and its power increased, and in that time was first made the Council of the Wise, that is called the White Council. And therein were Elrond, and Galadriel, and Círdan, and other lords of the Eldar, and with them were Mithrandir and Curanir. And Curanir, that was Saruman the White, was chosen to be their chief, for he had most studied the devices of Sauron of old. Galadriel indeed had wished that Mithrandir should be the head of the council, and Saruman begrudged them for that, for his pride and desire of mastery was grown great. But Mithrandir refused the office, since he would have no ties and no allegiance, save to those who sent him, and he would abide in no place, nor be subject to any summons. But Saruman now began to study the lore of the Rings of Power, their making, and their history. This is a very revealing quote. Galadriel advocates that Gandalf should lead the council, but he refuses, and so Saruman is chosen to lead instead. And here I almost feel like Galadriel is a Cassandra figure, cursed to know the truth, but never to be believed. Back in Aman, she was no fan of Feanor. Tolkien describes them as unfriends. But he still went on to lead the Noldor down a destructive path. In the Second Age, she's no fan of Anatar, Sauron. But Celebrian insists on currying favor with him with disastrous results. And here in the Third Age, she sees Gandalf as a better leader than Saruman, but Sauron becomes leader anyway, making the White Council way less effective. I've done a video on the White Council if you want more detail, but essentially, the Council meets a few times throughout the Third Age, including 2941, the year that Bilbo and the dwarves retake Erebor. And Peter Jackson portrays a version of this in the Hobbit trilogy. There was an assault on Dol Guldur, Galadriel was likely involved, and Sauron was driven out. But ever the shadow in Mirkwood grew deeper, and to Dol Guldur evil things repaired out of all the dark places of the world. And they were united again under one will, and their malice was directed against the elves and the survivors of Númenor. Therefore at last the council was again summoned, and the lore of the rings was much debated. But Mithrandir spoke to the council, saying, "It is not needed that the ring should be found, for while it abides on earth and is not unmade, still the power that it holds will live, and Sauron will grow and have hope. The might of the elves and the elf friends is less now than of old. Soon he will be too strong for you even without the great ring, for he rules the 9, and of the 7 he has recovered 3. We must strike." To this Curanir now assented, desiring that Sauron should be thrust from Dol Guldur, which was nigh to the river, and should have leisure to search there no longer. Therefore, for the last time, he aided the council, and they put forth their strength, and they assailed Dol Guldur, and drove Sauron from his hold, and Mirkwood, for a brief while, was made wholesome again. But their stroke was too late, For the Dark Lord had foreseen it, and he had long prepared all his movements, and his 9 servants had gone before him to make ready for his coming. Therefore his flight was but a feint, and he soon returned. And ere the wise could prevent him, he re-entered his kingdom in Mordor, and reared once again the dark towers of Barad-dûr. And in that year the White Council met for the last time, and Curanir withdrew to Isengard, and took counsel with none save himself. So Galadriel and the rest of the White Council forced Sauron to flee Dol Guldur. But he'd already planned on a tactical retreat, and after he establishes himself in Mordor, the White Council meets for the last time in the year 2953. After that, Saruman leaves the council and it disbands. I would say that the Council of Elrond in The Lord of the Rings is Elrond's attempt at reviving the White Council concept. There is one other event of note during this time, a tragic event that certainly has a strong impact on Galadriel. In The Lord of the Rings appendices, we get this quote. In 2509, Celebrian, wife of Elrond, was journeying to Lorien when she was waylaid in the Redhorn Pass, and her escort being scattered by the sudden assault of the orcs. She was seized and carried off. She was pursued and rescued by Elladan and Elrohir, but not before she had suffered torment and had received a poisoned wound. She was brought back to Imladris, and though healed in body by Elrond, lost all delight in Middle-earth, and the next year went to the Havens and passed over sea. So Celebrian is the daughter, and canonically the only child, of Galadriel and Celeborn. She has 3 children with Elrond, the twins, Elladan and Elrohir, and Arwen. In 2509, we're told that she's journeying to Lorien, I would guess, to see her parents, and she's likely traveling from her home at Rivendell. As she's crossing the Misty Mountains at the Redhorn Pass, aka Caradhras, the same place where years later the Fellowship would be forced to turn back and venture into Moria, Celebrian's escort is assaulted by orcs and she's captured. Her twin sons rescue her, but not before she receives a poisoned wound from the orcs. She's brought to Rivendell, Elrond heals her physically, but she then leaves Middle-earth forever, heading west without any of her family. That's a drastic step, and it's one that must cause great anguish for Galadriel. She's not allowed to return to the west at that time. It's not even an option for her to accompany her daughter. She has to let her go. And the fact that Celebrian was coming to see her probably fills her with guilt and regret. And she's got hundreds of years to dwell on this tragedy. Amidst the sadness, there's likely anger as well at Sauron and the orcs who took Celebrian away from her. As for the poisoned wound, we do know that orcs did use poisoned weapons, but the fact that she was brought to Rivendell and Elrond healed her, but some remnant of the experience lingered, causing her to head for the Havens, really sounds like an echo of Frodo in Lord of the Rings. When Frodo is stabbed by the Morgul blade, we get this quote from Aragorn. "Frodo has been touched by the weapons of the enemy," said Strider. "There is some poison or evil at work that is beyond my skill to drive out. But do not give up hope, Sam." And just like Celebrian, Frodo was brought to Rivendell just in time for Elrond to heal him. But just like Celebrian, he's not completely healed. Yes, he has the added pain of being a ring bearer, but this quote near the end of The Return of the King is certainly about his Morgul blade wound. Return of the King, Chapter 9. One evening, Sam came into the study and found his master looking very strange. He was very pale, and his eyes seemed to see things far away. "What's the matter, Mr. Frodo?" said Sam. "I am wounded," he answered. "Wounded. It will never really heal." And then he got up, and the turn seemed to pass, and he was quite himself the next day. It was not until afterwards that Sam recalled that the date was October the 6th. 2 years before, on that day, it was dark in the dell under Weathertop. Aragorn would certainly know about Celebrian's story. He's good friends with the twins, after all. So when he sees Frodo's injury, part of the reason he might think of Elrond is because he knows Elrond successfully saved Celebrian's life from a similar wound. So, is it possible that Celebrian was also stabbed by a Morgul blade, and that to deal with the trauma of her near-death experience, she headed west? I think that's a reasonable interpretation of events. And if that's the case, then due to the blade's association with the Nazgul, it brings up the possibility that one of the 9 stabbed her, which makes the whole event seem more planned and less random. In any case, I'll leave that rabbit hole for someone to write a good fanfic about. And so we come to it at last. Galadriel, during the Lord of the Rings. It only took 4 videos, but here we are! The first hint of Galadriel in the Fellowship of the Ring is during Frodo's stay in Rivendell, when Elrond heals his wound. I've mentioned the following passage in my video about the Grey Company and the twins, but it's also relevant to Galadriel. This is from Book 2, Chapter 1, and it's occurring after the Council of Elrond. The hobbits had been nearly 2 months in the House of Elrond, and November had gone by with the last shreds of autumn, and December was passing when the scouts began to return. The sons of Elrond, Elladan and Elrohir, were the last to return. They had made a great journey, passing down the Silver Lode into a strange country, but of their errand they would not speak to any, save to Elrond. The strange country mentioned in that quote, associated with the Silver Lode River, is Lothlorien. Galadriel is their grandmother. So it appears that Elrond sent his sons to speak with Galadriel, and they brought a message back for his ears only. We don't know definitively what this was about, but I think Elrond trusted his sons to pass along the top secret news that the Fellowship might be passing through Lothlorien, and Galadriel should be ready to lend assistance. The message back is even less definitive, but perhaps Galadriel looked in her mirror and sent a message of what she saw back to Elrond. Just a guess. Now, we don't hear much about Galadriel through the next few chapters, until the Fellowship arrives in Lothlorien after losing Gandalf in Moria. One quick note about the trees of Lothlorien. They are Malorn trees that were originally native to Aman. Then the elves of Tol Eressëa gifted Malorn seeds to Numenor, who in turn later gifted the seeds to the elves of Middle-earth. So it went elves, Numenorians, elves. We get this interesting description in Unfinished Tales. This is from A Description of the Island of Numenor. Only here, Numenor, grew the mighty golden tree Melinorne, reaching after 5 centuries a height scarce less than it achieved in Eressëa itself. Its fruit was a nut with a silver shale, and some were given as a gift by Tar Aldarion, the 6th king of Numenor, to King Gil-galad of Lindon. They did not take root in that land, but Gil-galad gave some to his kinswoman Galadriel, and under her power they grew and flourished in the guarded land of Lothlorien beside the river Anduin, until the High Elves at last left Middle-earth. But they did not reach the height or girth of the great groves of Numenor. So it was very wise of Gil-galad to share these seeds with Galadriel, and she obviously put them to good use. It's interesting that these huge trees grew even larger in Numenor. Maybe we'll see some of those Malorn groves in the Amazon series. But back to the Fellowship. They've arrived in Lothlorien, and they're brought before Galadriel and Celeborn. Note when Celeborn mentions the messages, I think he's referring to that errand that the twins undertook for Elrond. This is a longer passage, but it includes some direct quotes from Galadriel. The chamber was filled with a soft light. Its walls were green and silver, and its roof of gold. Many elves were seated there. On 2 chairs beneath the bole of the tree and canopied by a living bough, there sat, side by side, Celebrian and Galadriel. They stood up to greet their guests after the manner of elves, even those who were accounted mighty kings. Very tall they were, and the lady no less tall than the lord, and they were grave and beautiful. They were clad wholly in white, and the hair of the lady was of deep gold, and the hair of the Lord Celebrian was of silver, long and bright. But no sign of age was upon them, unless it were in the depths of their eyes, for these were keen as lances in the starlight, and yet profound, the wells of deep memory. Haldir led Frodo before them, and the Lord welcomed him in his own tongue. The Lady Galadriel said no word, but looked long upon his face. When all the guests were seated before his chair, the Lord looked at them again. "Here there are 8, he said. 9 were to set out, so said the messages. But maybe there has been some change of counsel that we have not heard. Elrond is far away, and darkness gathers between us, and all this year the shadows have grown longer." "Nay, there was no change of counsel," said the Lady Galadriel, speaking for the first time. "Gandalf the Grey set out with the company, but he did not pass the borders of this land. Now tell us where he is, for I much desire to speak with him again. But I cannot see him from afar, unless he comes within the fences of Lorien. A grey mist is about him, and the ways of his feet and of his mind are hidden from me." "Alas," said Aragorn, "Gandalf the Grey fell into shadow. He remained in Moria and did not escape." "Alas," said Celebrian, "we long have feared that under Carithras a terror slept. But had I known that the dwarves had stirred up this evil in Moria again, I would have forbidden you to pass the northern borders, you and all that went with you. And if it were possible, one would say that at the last Gandalf fell from wisdom into folly, going needlessly into the net of Moria." "He would be rash indeed that said that thing," said Galadriel gravely. "Needless were none of the deeds of Gandalf in life. Those that followed him knew not his mind, and cannot report his full purpose. But however it may be with the guide, the followers are blameless. Do not repent of your welcome to the dwarf. If our folk had been exiled long and far from Lothlorien, who of the Galathrim, even Celeborn the Wise, would pass nigh and would not wish to look upon their ancient home, though it had become an abode of dragons? Your quest is known to us," said Galadriel, looking at Frodo, "but we will not here speak of it more openly. Yet not in vain will it prove, maybe, that you came to this land seeking aid, as Gandalf himself plainly purposed. For the Lord of the Galathrim is accounted the wisest of the elves of Middle-earth, and a giver of gifts beyond the power of kings. I it was who first summoned the White Council, and if my designs had not gone amiss, it would have been governed by Gandalf the Grey, and then mayhap things would have gone otherwise. But even now there is hope left. I will not give you counsel, saying do this or do that. For not in doing or contriving, or in choosing between this course and another can I avail, but only in knowing what was and is, and in part also what shall be. But this I will say to you, your quest stands upon the edge of a knife. Stray but a little, and it will fail, to the ruin of all. Yet hope remains, while all the company is true." And with that word she held them with her eyes, and in silence looked searchingly at each of them in turn. None save Legolas and Aragorn could long endure her glance. Sam quickly blushed and hung his head. At length the Lady Galadriel released them from her eyes, and she smiled. "Do not let your hearts be troubled," she said. "Tonight you shall sleep in peace." Then they sighed and felt suddenly weary, as those who had been questioned long and deeply, though no words had been spoken openly. I find it interesting that Galadriel seems to scold Celeborn in this quote. Celeborn, somewhat rudely, insults Gandalf's memory right in front of the grieving fellowship with the line, "One would say that at the last Gandalf fell from wisdom into folly, going needlessly into the net of Moria." He's basically saying, that was a dumb choice, I wouldn't have made it. And Galadriel immediately snaps back with, "He would be rash indeed that said that thing. Needless were none of the deeds of Gandalf in life." She's calling Celeborn out. Notice how she diplomatically compliments Celeborn a bit later with the line, "The Lord of the Galadhrim is accounted the wisest of the elves of Middle-earth, and a giver of gifts beyond the power of kings." I think she's just trying to counter her rebuke with a compliment, because I don't really think that line is true. Celeborn isn't accounted the wisest of the elves of Middle-earth. She is. But I think this also shows her loyalty to Gandalf. They share a very strong bond. When Gandalf is reborn on the mountaintop having cast down the Balrog, he wouldn't have lasted very long if Galadriel hadn't sent Gwaihir, the eagle, to find him and bring him to Lothlorien for healing. And that bond goes both ways. I love this moment when Gandalf arrives at Meduseld, and Grima makes the mistake of insulting Galadriel to Gandalf's face. We see a bit of this exchange in the Two Towers movie, but the book version includes this moving tribute to Galadriel that Gandalf sings in the hall. This is from the Two Towers, Book 3, Chapter 6, and we open with Grima speaking. "Then it is true, as Eomer reported, that you are in league with the sorceress of the Golden Wood?" said Wormtongue. "It is not to be wondered at. Webs of deceit were ever woven in Dwymordine." Gimli strode a pace forward, but felt suddenly the hand of Gandalf clutch him by the shoulder, and he halted, standing stiff as stone. "In Dwymordine, in Lorien, seldom have walked the feet of men. Few mortal eyes have seen the light that lies there ever long and bright. Galadriel, Galadriel, clear is the water of your well. White is the star in your white hand. Unmarred, unstained is leaf and land in Dwymordine, in Lorien, more fair than thoughts of mortal men." Thus Gandalf softly sang, and then suddenly he changed. Casting his tattered cloak aside, he stood up and leaned no longer on his staff, and he spoke in a clear, cold voice. "The wise speak only of what they know, Grima, son of Galmod. A witless worm have you become. Therefore be silent, and keep your forked tongue behind your teeth. I have not passed through fire and death to bandy crooked words with a serving man till the lightning falls." Bang! Gandalf sings a song, then drops the hammer on Grima. I do find it interesting that the song references the elven ring, Nenya. White is the star in your white hand. Maybe Ixnay on the Ingray occasion lay. But we do see this bond between Galadriel and Gandalf play out in meaningful ways. Notably, when Gandalf the White reunites with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, he has messages for all three from Galadriel. And this includes an instruction to Aragorn to take the paths of the dead with the Grey Company. "Near is the hour when the lost should come forth, and the Grey Company ride from the north. But dark is the path appointed for thee. The dead watch the road that leads to the sea." So Galadriel is obviously keeping tabs on Gandalf and the Fellowship, perhaps through the use of her mirror. And she seems to have prophetic abilities. And now we come to arguably the most important moment in Galadriel's life. The thousands of years of her life and life's choices all come to a point, and that moment happens in the chapter, The Mirror of Galadriel. And much of the following quote was wisely used in the movie. It's one of Tolkien's best passages. "Here is the mirror of Galadriel," she said. "I have brought you here so that you may look in it, if you will." The air was very still and the dell was dark, and the elf lady beside him was tall and pale. "What shall we look for, and what shall we see?" asked Frodo, filled with awe. "Many things I can command the mirror to reveal," she answered, "and to some it can show what they desire to see. But the mirror will also show things unbidden, and those are often stranger and more profitable than things which we wish to behold. What you will see, if you leave the mirror free to work, I cannot tell, for it shows things that were, and things that are, and things that yet may be. But which it is that he sees, even the wisest cannot always tell. Do you wish to look? Do you advise me to look?" asked Frodo. "No," she said. "I do not counsel you one way or the other. I am not a counselor. You may learn something, and whether what you see be fair or evil, that may be profitable, and yet it may not. Seeing is both good and perilous. Yet I think, Frodo, that you have courage and wisdom enough for the venture, or I would not have brought you here. Do as you will." "I will look," said Frodo, and he climbed on the pedestal and bent over the dark water. Frodo proceeds to see a series of images, ending with the Eye of Sauron. Then the eye began to rove, searching this way and that, and Frodo knew with certainty and horror that among the many things that it sought, he himself was one. But he also knew that it could not see him, not yet, not unless he willed it. The ring that hung upon its chain about his neck grew heavy, heavier than a great stone, and his head was dragged downwards. The mirror seemed to be growing hot, and curls of steam were rising from the water. He was slipping forward. "Do not touch the water," said the Lady Galadriel softly. The vision faded, and Frodo found that he was looking at the cool stars twinkling in the silver basin. He stepped back, shaking all over and looking at the lady. "I know what it was that you last saw," she said, "for that is also in my mind. Do not be afraid, but do not think that only by singing amid the trees, or even by the slender arrows of elven bows, is this land of Lothlorien maintained and defended against the enemy. I say to you, Frodo, that even as I speak to you, I perceive the Dark Lord and know his mind, or all of his mind that concerns the elves, and he gropes ever to see me and my thought, but still the door is closed. Do you not see now wherefore your coming is to us as the footstep of doom? For if you fail, then we are laid bare to the enemy. Yet if you succeed, then our power is diminished, and Lothlorien will fade, and the tides of time will sweep it away. We must depart into the west, or dwindle to a rustic folk of dell and cave, slowly to forget and to be forgotten." "You are wise and fearless and fair, Lady Galadriel," said Frodo. "I will give you the One Ring, if you ask for it. It is too great a matter for me." Galadriel laughed, with a sudden clear laugh. "Wise the Galadriel may be," she said, "yet here she has met her match in courtesy. Gently are you revenged for my testing of your heart at our first meeting. You begin to see with a keen eye. I do not deny that my heart has greatly desired to ask what you offer. For many long years I had pondered what I might do, should the great ring come into my hands, and behold, it was brought here within my grasp. The evil that was devised long ago works on in many ways, whether Sauron himself stands or falls. Would that not have been a noble deed to set to the credit of his ring, if I had taken it by force or fear from my guest? And now at last it comes. You will give me the ring freely. In place of the Dark Lord you will set up a queen, and I shall not be dark, but beautiful and terrible as the morning and the night. Fair as the sea and the sun and the snow upon the mountain, dreadful as the storm and the lightning, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair." She lifted up her hand, and from the ring that she wore there issued a great light that illumined her alone and left all else dark. She stood before Frodo, seeming now tall beyond measurement, and beautiful beyond enduring, terrible and worshipful. Then she let her hand fall, and the light faded, and suddenly she laughed again, and lo, she was shrunken, a slender elf woman clad in simple white, whose gentle voice was soft and sad. "I passed the test," she said. "I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel." They stood for a long while in silence. At length the lady spoke again. "Let us return," she said. "In the morning you must depart, for now we have chosen, and the tides of fate are flowing." Now that is fantasy at its best. It's such compelling, tension-filled, beautiful writing. There are a handful of moments in The Lord of the Rings when the fate of Middle-earth rests in the balance, or on the edge of a knife, as Galadriel says. This moment shapes Middle-earth, and it defines Galadriel. She sums it up. "I passed the test. I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel." So here she's using her wisdom and foresight to predict that her rejection of the ring will grant her a pardon at long last from the Valar. And she's right. We get this confirmation in one of Tolkien's letters. "I was particularly interested in your remarks about Galadriel. I think it is true that I owe much of this character to Christian and Catholic teaching and imagination about Mary. But actually, Galadriel was a penitent. In her youth, a leader in the rebellion against the Valar. At the end of the First Age, she proudly refused forgiveness or permission to return. She was pardoned because of her resistance to the final and overwhelming temptation to take the ring for herself." And there it is. The pardon that for many, many years she didn't want. But times change, and when this pardon finally arrives, she's ready to accept it. We come now to the Fellowship leaving Lothlorien. In part 1 of this series, I covered Namarie, the song of regret that Galadriel sings as the Fellowship paddles away, so I won't cover that again. But I do want to mention the gifts that Galadriel gives to each member of the Fellowship. And here, we're reminded that Galadriel is a Noldor elf. The Noldor, devotees of Aule the Smith, are renowned for their inventions and craftsmanship. Feanor, Celebrian, the Gwaith y Myrdain, the jewelsmiths, all Noldor elves. Galadriel embraces this tradition. She has the elf stone and the elven ring Nenya, both powerful magic items crafted by Celebrian. We've seen her use another powerful magic item, the Mirror of Galadriel, which functions as a sort of water-based crystal ball. I think it's reasonable to assume that Galadriel herself had a hand in creating the mirror. Her ring, Nenya, is known as the Ring of Adamant, but it's also known as the Ring of Water. I think she used Nenya's power to craft this scrying device. It's similar, but with notable differences, to the Palantiri, crafted by fellow Noldor elf Feanor. One of the gifts she gives is lembas bread, very helpful in assisting the Fellowship. There's a quote from Two Towers that says, "Often in their hearts they thanked the Lady of Lorien for the gift of lembas, for they could eat of it and find new strength even as they ran." It's like they went to an elven food truck. But interestingly, Galadriel learned the recipe for lembas from Melian back in the First Age. So here in the Third Age, we see Lothlorien protected, much like the girdle of Melian protected Doriath, and Galadriel is still making lembas. She also provides the Fellowship with cloaks, and we're told that she made them herself. Book 2, Chapter 8. You are indeed high in the favor of the lady, for she herself and her maidens wove this stuff, and never before have we clad strangers in the garb of our own people. She gives Sam some elven rope that may also have been made by her hands. In Book 4, Chapter 1, we get Sam pondering how to untie the rope. Sam: hard parting with anything I brought out of the elven country. Made by Galadriel herself, too, maybe. Galadriel, he murmured, nodding his head mournfully. He looked up and gave one last pull to the rope, as if in farewell. To the complete surprise of both the hobbits, it came loose. Sam fell over, and the long gray coils slithered silently down on top of him. Frodo laughed. "Who tied the rope?" he said. So here we get the implication that Galadriel crafted the rope and that it has magical properties. Other gifts include the boats that they take down the Anduin, a golden belt for Boromir, silver belts for Merry and Pippin, arrows and a bow strung with elven hair for Legolas, probably not Galadriel's hair, as that's a different gift, a sheath for Anduril that comes with this quote, "The blade that is drawn from this sheath shall not be stained or broken, even in defeat." That's powerful magic, especially since you're talking about the newly forged blade that was broken. She also gives the elf stone to Aragorn, which can be interpreted as her approving of the relationship between Aragorn and Arwen. She gives Frodo the Phial of Galadriel, which becomes instrumental in defeating Shelob and surviving the Tower of Cirith Ungol. "In this phial," she said, "is caught the light of a Yarandil's star," a Silmaril, "set amid the waters of my fountain. It will shine still brighter when night is about you. May it be a light to you in dark places when all other lights go out." We see again the connection to water. I think Galadriel personally created the phial using Nenya. She gives Sam a small wooden box with a G on it, for Galadriel or perhaps garden, containing earth from Galadriel's orchard, and a single nut from a malorn tree. We'll talk more about this gift at the end of the video. And to Gimli, she gives 3 strands of her hair. I've talked about the significance of this gift in another video, but briefly, thousands of years earlier, Feanor asked for a lock of her hair 3 times, and she denied him each time. Gimli requests a single strand of her hair, and she grants him 3, showing, I think, that she holds him in higher esteem than she did Feanor, mainly because Feanor was asking for his own fascination, whereas Gimli wanted to use the strand as a symbol of unity between elves and dwarves. So that's quite a haul for the Fellowship, right? I mean, that's like Christmas. They needed the boats just to hold all the goods. And as I've noted, these items are very important to the future of Middle-earth. And now we jump to the final days of the War of the Ring. Of course, Gondor is fighting the Battle of Pelennor Fields. But Galadriel and Celeborn are in a desperate fight versus Sauron's forces as well. This is from the appendices. 3 times Lorien had been assailed from Dol Guldur. But besides the valor of the elven people of that land, the power that dwelt there was too great for any to overcome, unless Sauron had come there himself. Though grievous harm was done to the fair woods on the borders, the assaults were driven back. And when the shadow passed, Celeborn came forth and led the host of Lorien over Anduin in many boats. They took Dol Guldur, and Galadriel threw down its walls and laid bare its pits, and the forest was cleansed. And on the day of the new year of the elves, Celeborn and Thranduil met in the midst of the forest, and they renamed Mirkwood Erin Las Gallen, the Wood of Green Leaves. Thranduil took all the northern region as far as the mountains that rise in the forest for his realm, and Celeborn took all the southern wood below the Narrows and named it East Lorien. But after the passing of Galadriel in a few years, Celeborn grew weary of his realm and went to Imladris to dwell with the sons of Elrond. In the Greenwood, the Sylvan Elves remained untroubled, but in Lorien there lingered sadly only a few of its former people, and there was no longer light or song in Caris Galadriel. So there's a lot of information here. First, note that Galadriel threw down the walls of Dol Guldur, so she was involved in the fight. She and Celebrian avoided the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age, and the War of the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age, but here at last, at the end of the Third Age, they make their stand. We see that Lothlorien fades now that the Elven Ring Nenya's powers have dissipated, and Galadriel departs for the west without Celebrian. He does eventually go west, but Middle-earth has always been his home, so I think he wants to linger in Middle-earth a little longer. Of course, we get a series of farewells after the war, but I think the most intriguing is Galadriel's farewell to Treebeard. First, I need to set up this quote. We're going to jump back to the Two Towers, Book 3, Chapter 4, when Treebeard is talking with the hobbits. Treebeard fell silent, striding along, and yet making hardly a sound with his great feet. Then he began to hum again, and passed into a murmuring chant. Gradually the hobbits became aware that he was chanting to them. In the willow meads of Tessaranon I walked in the spring. Ah, the sight and the smell of the spring in Non Tessarion. And I said, that was good. So Treebeard is fondly remembering the willow meads of Tessaranon, where he used to walk. That land no longer exists. It was part of Beleriand that sank into the sea at the end of the First Age. It's gone. But now I'm going to read you Galadriel's farewell to Treebeard, and she's going to reference this place and this song, showing her understanding of Treebeard and his history. Book 6, Chapter 6. Then Treebeard said farewell to each of them in turn, and he bowed 3 times, slowly and with great reverence, to Celebrian and Galadriel. It is long, long since we met by stock or by stone, he said. It is sad that we should meet only thus at the ending, for the world is changing. I feel it in the water, I feel it in the earth, and I smell it in the air. I do not think we shall meet again. And Celebrian said, I do not know, eldest. But Galadriel said, not in Middle-earth, nor until the lands that lie under the wave are lifted up again. Then, in the willow meads of Tessaranon, we may meet in the spring. Farewell. Note the line, I feel it in the water. Obviously, Galadriel speaks those lines at the beginning of Jackson's trilogy, but in the books, it's Treebeard. So to me, this is an enigmatically sad farewell. On the surface, it sounds hopeful. Then, in the willow meads of Tessaranon, we may meet in the spring. But the conditions sound fairly unattainable. When the waves recede and Tessaranon returns to a land of willows. And Galadriel adds, not in Middle-earth. She knows that's true because she's never coming back. It seems to be a way of agreeing with Treebeard that they'll never meet again without saying, I agree. And so Galadriel and the Valar finally make peace, and she sails west from the Grey Havens. Just a couple of follow-up points. In later years, Legolas and Gimli sail west together. Gimli is the first and only dwarf ever allowed to sail west. And in the appendices, we get a hint of how that came to be. We have heard tell that Legolas took Gimli, Glóin's son, with him because of their great friendship, greater than any that has been between elf and dwarf. If this is true, then it is strange indeed that a dwarf should be willing to leave Middle-earth for any love, or that the Eldar should receive him, or that the Lords of the West should permit it. But it is said that Gimli went also out of desire to see again the beauty of Galadriel. And it may be that she, being mighty among the Eldar, obtained this grace for him. More cannot be said of this matter. So we get the strong implication that Galadriel pulled a few strings and got permission for Gimli to journey west. That's a huge honor, and maybe the greatest gift that she gave anyone. But that brings me to my last point in this 4-video Galadriel epic, the longest character study series I've ever done. And if you've been here through the whole series, then thanks so much. I really appreciate getting to share Tolkien with you. All right, but back to the point. Remember when I mentioned that Galadriel's gift to Sam was a box of soil and a seed? Now I think this was in response to Sam's viewing in the Mirror of Galadriel. He saw the trees being cut down in the Shire and industrialization taking over. The version of the Shire we see in the Scouring of the Shire. And he was outraged and determined to go back. But Galadriel reminded him of the importance of his quest, kept him focused. So she gives him this box. And after the ring is destroyed and the Shire is reclaimed in the Battle of Bywater, Sam suddenly remembers the box. And we get this passage in Return of the King, Book 6, Chapter 9. Then suddenly one day, for he had been too busy for weeks to give a thought to his adventures, he remembered the gift of Galadriel. He brought the box out and showed it to the other travelers, for so they were now called by everyone, and asked their advice. "I wondered when you would think of it," said Frodo. "Open it." Inside it was filled with a gray dust, soft and fine, in the middle of which was a seed, like a small nut with a silver shale. "What shall I do with this?" said Sam. "Throw it in the air on a breezy day, and let it do its work," said Pippin. "On what?" said Sam. "Choose one spot as a nursery, and see what happens to the plants there," said Merry. "But I'm sure the lady would not like me to keep it all for my own garden, now that so many folk have suffered," said Sam. "Use all the wits and knowledge you have of your own, Sam," said Frodo, "and then use the gift to help your work and better it. And use it sparingly. There's not much here, and I expect every grain has a value." So Sam planted saplings in all the places where specially beautiful or beloved trees had been destroyed, and he put a grain of the precious dust in the soil at the root of each. He went up and down the Shire in this labor, but if he paid special attention to Hobbiton and Bywater, no one blamed him. And at the end he found that he still had a little of the dust left. So he went to the 3-farthing stone, which is as near to the center of the Shire as no matter, and cast it into the air with his blessing. The little silver nut he planted in the party field where the tree had once been, and he wondered what would come of it. All through the winter he remained as patient as he could and tried to restrain himself from going round constantly to see if anything was happening. Spring surpassed his wildest hopes. His trees began to sprout and grow, as if time was in a hurry and wished to make 1 year do for 20. In the party field, a beautiful young sapling leaped up. It had silver bark and long leaves and burst into golden flowers in April. It was indeed a malorn, and it was the wonder of the neighborhood. In after years, as it grew in grace and beauty, it was known far and wide, and people would come long journeys to see it. The only malorn west of the mountains and east of the sea, and one of the finest. Altogether, 1420 in the Shire was a marvelous year. Not only was there wonderful sunshine and delicious rain, in due times and perfect measure, but there seemed something more, an air of richness and growth, and a gleam of a beauty beyond that of mortal summers that flicker and pass upon this middle earth. She gave him back the Shire. That was her gift. It's such a generous act, it just makes me smile. She gave Sam a gift that he could not use on the way to Mount Doom, or at any time during the war. It was a gift intended to improve lives after It's such a hopeful gift. And I love the extra touch that the party tree from Book 1, Chapter 1 has been replaced by a Malorn tree. The only one west of the mountains and east of the sea. So Galadriel's final garden in Middle-earth is the Shire. And that's a beautiful send-off for one of the most memorable characters in literary history. Namarie, Galadriel. And for the rest of you, I'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.